After the city is mapped out, they won't leave one apartment house door not knocked on. There won't be a door in Harlem that will not have been knocked on to see that whatever black face lives behind that door is registered to vote by a certain time this year. Nobody will have an excuse not to be registered. We'll ask him, let us see your card. If you don't have the sense of responsibility to get registered, we'll move you out of town.
Okay, great. Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 2 of Poder Speaks. And today we have a very special guest, Dr. Dion McLaughlin. And so I am Sarah Castillo. And just to provide y'all with a brief introduction or biography, rather, of our guest, Dr. McLaughlin. They are a professor at the Department of Education and Leadership of North Carolina Central University. And Dr. McLaughlin is an experienced and dedicated educator who focuses much of their work in promoting culturally responsive teaching for Latina and Black students. And so I want to thank you so much, Dr. McLaughlin, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Sarah.
Yeah, of course. So before we get into the questions and the good stuff of this conversation, I just want to do a quick icebreaker, quick fun icebreaker just to kick it off. So I did a little bit of creeping on your biography, and I saw that you are from Jamaica. And so I guess one of my questions, I'm Dominican, so we have the Caribbean connection here. So I just wanted to ask you, what is your favorite Jamaican food?
Okay, that's really easy. Patty with cocoa bread. So I love plantains too, but definitely patty with cocoa bread would be my favorite.
Nice. I've tried beef patties before, and I want to try jerk chicken. Really
Okay,
bad.
yeah. So that's definitely a close second. Love the jerk chicken also.
Definitely. So we'll just kick it off to the first question. So Dr. McLaughlin, can you talk about why you became an educator?
Sure, absolutely. So much like a lot of college students who you graduate from college really not knowing exactly what you want to do, I was one of those students. So I double majored in Spanish and economics. And so I knew I was passionate about Spanish. And so one of the first positions my first real full-time job was working for Concilio Hispano, which is a Latinx human service agency in the Boston area. And so I worked initially with a program called Un Paso Más, which was an ESL program, and also did some teaching as an ESL teacher. And I also worked with another program, Primavera, which was a pregnant and parenting teens program. And then I became the program director for 3 programs, and the third program was Ahora, and that program was a youth enrichment dropout prevention program. It was located at Cambridge Ranger Latin High School, and I think that's where I became really passionate about working in schools, working with students. I became a MECO director, so I work with a voluntary desegregation program in the Boston area also, and that basically is a voluntary deseg, is students who are students of color, basically living in the city of Boston, voluntarily go to school in the suburbs. So essentially I was a K-12 director for a program in 2 different communities. And from there, did some teaching as an ESL teacher, as I mentioned. I taught a course at Lexington High School, which I developed, Racial Issues in America, Contemporary and Historical Study. And I also became an assistant principal. So I went sort of that non-traditional circuitous route where I got my licensure in Massachusetts. I became a principal at a small high school in Massachusetts, moved to North Carolina about 16 years ago. And I've worked in this area in Chapel Hill and in Durham as an assistant principal and principal. And so my second position in higher ed at North Carolina Central University, I'm a recently tenured associate professor. So I think for me, the passion really was, and now I work with teachers who want to become principals. That's kind of the group I work with. It's really just, I loved the idea of making an impact on schools, working with adults, impacting principals and students. I think that for me was the real draw.
Wow, that sounds amazing. And I can just imagine like the weather change from living in Massachusetts to North Carolina was definitely like a shock to you.
Absolutely. It was really worth the move. for the weather alone. If there was no other benefits to moving, it was absolutely worth it for the move. I love the weather in North Carolina, especially this time of year.
Right, right. So you did answer what is the work that you do. So I will just go into looking at the North Carolina education system right now. What are your thoughts on it, and what are you working towards as an educator to kind of just reimagine the landscape of education here in North Carolina and in the South in general?
Sure, absolutely. And so when I think about sort of culturally responsive teaching and sort of what that looks like and my perspective, I think that, culturally that we have, as I'm sure you're well familiar with, the numbers that are changing. So right by 2024, it's expected that students of color are going to make up 56% of the students in our public schools. And Latinxs are expected to be 29%. Black students are expected to represent 15%, and the AAPI student community will be at about 6%. And so you contrast that with 79% of the teachers who are white, across the nation, 9% are Latinx and 7% are Black, and less than 3% are AAPI. So it really is critical for us to have educators who are culturally responsive, particularly given those numbers, right? That most of our teachers in public schools are white, but the students are students of color. And I think the content, so the curriculum content and also the course delivery, those are fundamental parts of culturally responsive teaching. And so I think that as we look at emphasizing content that's connected to students' lives, cultural reference, teaching from cultural strengths rather than sort of looking at a deficit model and sort of blaming our students for their own underperformance. I think that, when we look at those disparities in performance amongst historically underserved students, and really those inequitable learning environments that we see with students we really need our students to obtain the level of support that they need to develop to their full academic potential. And so I think by centering the histories, contributions, and realities of students of color, in a culturally responsive, equitable environment, that classroom teachers can disrupt inequities. They can amplify student voices, and I think encourage students of color to take an active role in improving the school environment.
Wow, amazing. So that kind of leads us to a very interesting topic for me. So it is evident that throughout American history, there has been it's been whitewashed to be taught in schools. So in your experience, Dr. McLaughlin, what is the best way to teach how racism has shaped systems in this country and overall continue to exist today? And this may speak to your perspective of that culturally responsive teaching. Very interesting topic. So I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Absolutely. I think it is critically important that we prepare students to engage in the diverse cultural context, that students are introduced to this historical and contemporary realities that are connected to bias, equity, racism, and privilege. And I think very few teacher education programs are preparing or adequately preparing our pre-service teachers to deliver instruction that's related to any of those aforementioned topics. And so as a result, right, there's limited instruction on those topics because teachers aren't adequately prepared to teach on them. So I think we approach this work fearlessly, with authenticity, as teachers consider how safe they are, because certainly that's been a topic of dialogue as well. Do teachers feel safe even broaching these subjects? I think we have to boldly state that these are discussions that are sanctioned by the state, by the state standards, the social studies standards, and that teachers can protect themselves by communicating in advance to parents, right, particularly our white parents, about their intentions to engage in critical reflections about equity, about bias, about racism and privilege. And I think the lens of this work has to be through the oppressed, right, through the oppression of people of color. And as difficult as it is to learn about oppression, it was significantly more difficult to experience it, right? So I think we approach the conversation, we talk about the need to critically reflect, and that we're not attempting to injure or harm or shame white children, right? And certainly we understand the whole notion of interest convergence, that we understand that in order for us to make some progress in this work, that the interests of white people need to converge with the interests of people of color. So we understand that there's a need to keep in mind that whole idea of interest convergence. I think that's an important piece as we approach. I'd say in terms of broaching this subject in schools, we begin with music, right? So we can open our discussion with the racial context of 2022. We can listen to protest anthems like Little Baby's The Bigger Picture, Rafa Pavon's song Sin Aire. I think we can revisit the Black Lives Matter movement, the summer of 2020. So really being aware, I think, of what changed in terms of the environment in just a year. And I think we look at the Middle Passage in terms of what do we teach historically. I think we look at critically engaging in conversations about defining CRT. What are some common assumptions when we say racism? What do we mean? When we say privilege, when we say bias, what do we mean? And having some common conversations. So not us having productive conversations, not prescriptive conversations, but productive conversations. I think we talk about Karen incidents and living while Black, examining white privilege. And I think we have conversations about power, about privilege, about racism and bias. And in addition, you look at sort of the local history, as well as some of the current racial issues. And I think as we sort of do almost a survey of history, because I think it's so important to not have an ahistorical conversation, is that we look at the Middle Passage, we have some conversations about slave narratives, about Reconstruction, that brief period of temporary progress, that we talk about and view some of those stereotypical messages that have been in the media from the early 19th century until well into the 20th century, and certainly obviously a lot of images that currently are promoted as well. But there are particular images that were created really just to maintain the status quo. You had images in newspapers and magazines and advertising, posters, canned food, kitchen and household goods with items related to happy slaves and the docile Negro and Sambo images, really just to justify Jim Crow segregation. You had this coon character that depicted Black men as lazy and easily frightened and inarticulate and idle. And you have these mammy images and exaggerated, distorted, really just vulgar images of Black women and Black children, sort of this dehumanization. And this was instructional, right? This rather institutional. This is through the major institutions of our society. And, you know, I think you can include Nina Simone's song, Strange Fruit. And obviously it was originally done by Billie Holiday. But I think you can talk about Black success, attracting white resentment and opposition, whether it's including information about 1898 and what happened in Wilmington, North Carolina, where you have whites who rampaged through the Black community, staged a coup essentially, and removed constitutionally elected Black officials from office. Or whether you talk about Easter Sunday of 1873, where 150 members of a Black local militia were massacred by a white mob. You talk about the role of Ida B. Wells, a journalist who led the fight against lynching. There are, of course, present day issues related to lynching, where there have been nooses that have been found at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. We've seen nooses been found on college campuses across our country. And people were lynched for minor infractions, right? For being suspected of stealing shoes, for bumping into a girl, there was a veteran who was lynched for refusing to take off his uniform and essentially, walk through town without just underwear. And so I think we teach American history by talking about the Harlem Renaissance, of course, that whole period was just a period related to sort of this notion of the new Negro and becoming more self-assertive and refusing to be dismissed by contempt or by fear or by shame. And that really whole shift in sentiment from Washington, right, from Booker T. Washington to W.E.B. Du Bois. And so there was that tremendous time of outpouring of literature, of art, of music. And I think as we think about how do we teach our racial history, and that is in fact American history. And so it's a story we don't tell. It's a hidden history. It's also a very recent history. We have a number of people who are alive today who were alive then. And I think it's teaching true history that includes Malcolm X and the Black Power movement. There's just so much power to listening to Malcolm speak. His speech, The Ballot or the Bullet, Malcolm was very honest. He was clear, he was insightful, he was energizing, he challenged Black people's thinking about ourselves. And the question he asked, who taught you to hate yourself? Who taught us to hate ourselves?
Who taught you, please, who taught you to hate the texture of your hair? Who taught you to hate the color of your skin to such extent that you bleach to get like the white man? Who taught you to hate the shape of your nose and the shape of your lips? Who taught you to hate yourself from the top of your head to the soles of your feet? Who taught you to hate your own kind? Who taught you to hate the race that you belong to? So much so that you don't want to be around each other.
The idea that America was unjust and that he was a voice during a very turbulent time in our country. And, just Ronald Stokes was killed by police in Los Angeles. There were 4 young girls that were killed in a church bombing. And his message was that we should not allow ourselves to be brutalized. And of course, you don't hear as much of Malcolm being taught in schools. But it was that message of we should protect ourselves by any means necessary. And I think when you look at a more current example, Janelle Monáe's song, Turntables, in which she focuses on revolution, on change, and centering the experiences of marginalized communities, just this iconic protest song, which just reminds us so much of the summer of 2020 and the Georgia gubernatorial election. In addition to what I've shared in terms of history, I think an integral part of examining our racial history and current reality is also just looking beyond Black and white, certainly. Black and white issues in our country. Cesar Chavez, Mexican-American labor leader and civil rights activist, basically dedicated his life's work to what he called La Causa and the struggle of farm workers in the United States to improve their working and living conditions through organizing, negotiating contracts with their employers. And, you had that anti-Mexican racism in Los Angeles that caused the zoot suit riots in June of 1943. And so we need to have conversations about these parts of our history as well. And I think we have conversations about more contemporary issues. So what are some key facts about US Latinxes? Is there such a thing as a Latino or Latinx identity? Do we use the term Hispanic? Do we use Latinx? What do Latinos think about race and racism, language, color, identity? I think we'd have conversations about the US conquest of Mexico. Statehood, the US Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor, who are you if you don't speak Spanish, right? Cuban-American immigration experiences from other Latinxes. I think we talk about the brief history of patterns of migration for Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, Cubans, Dominicans, Central Americans, South Americans. And I think we also talk about, I think an important part of our history is to talk about the AAPI experience, the Atlanta massacre and anti-Asian racism and violence, the Chinese Exclusion Act, where Chinese of course also challenged unfair laws, Japanese internment camps and the executive order of 9066. And I think looking at some of the work through the Immigrant History Initiative, A Brief History of Asians in America, and I think the whole model minority myth. And I think it's all of those topics that are part of how we should teach history, whether it's, so not only history, but contemporary and historical issues of equity, bias, racism, and privilege.
That was great. Thank you so much. That just made me think of so many things, but I would like to pull back and just comment on something you had said earlier about, it made me think about much of those topics and those themes that you touched on. I did not learn in, my K through 12. I had to take an elective class to learn about much of those, 19th century caricatures that perpetuated stereotypes that you still see today. And that kind of just reinforces why it's so important to teach these things. And I heard you mention critical race theory. And so that's a topic that I really was hoping that would be brought up. So if you could just very briefly just describe or kind of explain what that is, so our listeners can know what critical race theory is, because in the past year or so, it has become a very contentious and heated topic. So yeah, if you could very briefly just describe what that is for our listeners.
Absolutely. And of course, it has been a very heated topic of discussion. And I think it is important that, and a lot of times you have protests certainly around critical race theory without even understanding what in fact critical race theory is. And so I think it is really an important piece that we talk about, how do we, and I think if I can say this in sort of a brief way, sort of what critical race theory is. And I think part of what we can look at in terms of, what critical race theory is I think to consider what are called the tenets of critical race theory. I think that's one way to think about it, because it's really, I think that's probably the best way to discuss it. So, and there are four. So critical race theory was developed by Gloria Ladson-Billings and Tate in 1995. And so it was influenced by critical legal studies, but they created the concept of critical race theory. And they define it by, as I mentioned, they define it by mentioning tenets. And so there are four tenets that they describe. And the first one is that racism is endemic and ingrained in American life. And the second tenet they talk about is understanding race as property. And that's kind of a more complex idea that's not always included when people are talking about CRT. And it's not intuitive in terms of sort of grasping what it means. And then the idea of the reinterpretation of ineffective civil rights laws. And the fourth tenet of critical race theory is challenging claims of neutrality, objectivity, colorblindness, and meritocracy. And then there's the whole idea that storytelling is one of the strategies of CRT. So it's used particularly by people of color to counter the majority perspective. Yeah, the reality is really that schools are not likely teaching all four of those tenets, right? That's just the reality. So given the fact that we have a lot of pre-service teachers who themselves weren't trained and really aren't really conversant in these issues, they are not in a position really to be talking about this overall. You're not going to see that this is something that's fairly common. I think when you think about sort of what actually would be taught in schools, what might you see? I think it's possible that the idea of racism being endemic, meaning that it's not just a historical issue, right, as you were just describing, but a present day reality. So that could certainly come up if there's conversations about living while Black or anti-Asian hate crimes, right? And I think perhaps in a history class, there might be some conversation around sort of the reinterpretation of ineffective civil rights laws, because that's really about CRT activists questioning sort of how much did Blacks benefit from deseg, right? And really just that it came at a great cost to the Black community. That's largely the question, right? So that you have Black schools that were closed, you have many Black teachers and principals who lost their jobs, and that as a nation, we are even more segregated now than we were then. So, or as segregated, right? So I think that's sort of what that means around the whole idea of reinterpreting ineffective civil rights laws. It's questioning the validity of sort of at what cost did desegregation come? And so it's possible, but again, I don't think it's something prevalent in discussion, but certainly if there's conversations about Brown versus the Board of Education, that's in an American history class, that topic could come up. I think what perhaps there might be some more fear around discussing is the whole question of challenging claims of neutrality, objectivity, colorblindness, and meritocracy, right? This idea that there are just discussing some aspects of our history where it's clear that there were issues of, or raising the whole question of whether or not we are in fact meritocracy, the whole question of sort of the level playing field, and are we all starting at the same place, and sort of not mentioning some of the historical issues that took place in our country. So I think that might be perhaps largely where one of the issues are. But I think it's almost used as a catch-all phrase. It's just anything related to racial issues or racism is CRT. It's almost put there as if that's what that is. So I think that's part of the challenge. But you also, I think we were talking a little bit earlier about the whole question of sort of what do we know about what works for kids of color, and maybe even just how we can improve the learning environment for our kids. And I think that there's definitely work to be done in that area. And I think part of it is that there are a couple of really prominent issues that we are certainly very familiar with, and that's the underperformance of students of color. It's well documented. We're very much familiar with the data. And there's this lack of connection between best practices and actionable change. So that, we're familiar with the fact that you have students of color who are overrepresented in statistics like poverty and dropout rates and suspensions and expulsions, and then underrepresented in terms of placement and advanced placement courses and honors courses and college enrollment. So we know about those numbers. And then, as we conduct equity audits and we consider the environments in our schools, we notice things like who's enrolled in advanced math. And we know that what happens in elementary school in terms of that enrollment affects what happens to kids in middle school, and certainly puts kids on a certain trajectory once they get to high school in terms of limiting the advanced math classes they can take, where they even get to take an AP calculus course or a an AP chemistry course, depending on that trajectory. And so that all starts in elementary school and affects what happens to our kids all the way into high school. And so those are just really well documented issues around underachievement. And I think in terms of a connection, I think that there's a lack of connection between what we know about best practices and actionable change. Because I think we really do know what are some things that we can do to really to lessen the opportunity gap and improve the performance of our students of color. And I think as academicians, we spend a great deal of time theorizing, researching, and I think to what extent are we making connections, sharing what our research is, and ensuring that the best practices that are happening in the field are informing our research. I think we need to do a better job with that, making that connection between the best practices and research, and then of course, actionable change. And I think part of that begins with sort of this critical self-reflection. So we acknowledge as we are reflecting that families of color do not need to be fixed. They don't need to be rescued. They don't need to be pitied. And that we acknowledge issues of social, societal injustice. And as we've been talking about sort of getting a greater understanding about equity, privilege, bias, and racism, and certainly not only just historical issues, but also current issues. And I think moving from the place of just talking about equity issues, right, where we move from equity talk to equity execution or equity action. And I think as we look at working with students of color, that for me, part of that approach is to ask a question: what if Calvin was my son, right? Or what if Dulce was my daughter? So we're considering that the students that we're working with, we're personalizing the data, and not just seeing the students as sort of being this sort of spreadsheet of nameless numbers, but we're finding out our students' academic stories. We're getting to know who are the students behind those numbers. And I think that's an important approach. And I think the other part in terms of what perpetuates inequity is that we don't use those practices that can help our students of color to be successful. And I want to quickly share 6 of them, right? So I think that there's 6 things that teachers can do, research-based strategies to improve the performance of students of color. And one is leading discussions about race, racism, and the positive contributions of African Americans, Latinxes, and AAPI people. And I think that's through critical reflections that and when I say, I've sort of been using that term without explaining it, right? So I think a critical reflection is a process of just identifying, questioning, and assessing our deeply held assumptions. And so going through that process, I think, is an important part of having this conversation, and then changing or having an impact how we perceive events and issues and our beliefs. And so I think it's leading those discussions about racism and positive contributions of people of color. And then I think it's being dedicated to the success of our students. And so by being dedicated, we show our dedication by requiring our students to work hard, we show them that we care, we're available to them before school, after school, during the school day. We do what one of my former students said is called break it down to the ground, right? Which is that we take this complex material, we make it simplified, we make it accessible so our students can understand it, and we make it relevant, we make it clear. And I think a 4th strategy is that everyone gets called on. So as teachers, we make sure that students of color are part of the classroom discourse, that, we have turn-taking rules, and we're checking to see who wait time, and just making sure that all of our students of color are part of that discourse. And I think we're passionate about the subject matter. That means we're upbeat, we're cheerful. We make work not seem like work. We take perhaps a subject matter that might seem trivial or not as interesting for students, and we find a way to make it interesting for our students. And I think lastly, that we maintain highly structured environments. So those environments that are rigorous, that are organized, that are clear, with clear expectations. And I think if we want to see, we want to eliminate some of those inequities, we want to see our kids' performance in our K-12 settings increase, that I think it's really important that we make those connections between best practices and actionable change. And I think, part of the work that I do, so both as an associate professor and as the executive director of Critical Reflections on Race and Equity Initiative, our work is to focus on how can we share some of the best practices for working with students of color? What can we share around schools where we show principals who've been successful, right? Because we have examples of principals who are leading schools where kids are successful. And then a real focus on introducing students to contemporary and historical issues related to equity, bias, racism, and privilege is a huge part of what we're doing. And that's through an elective course. So we're focusing on working with middle school students and also high school students, and then training teachers and administrators to teach this course.
Wow. Yeah. And this segues very nicely into a closing question that I have, because the things that you speak of and just envisioning a future where it's just more inclusive and a better environment for the education of students of color. It's not an isolated effort. It's not only up to the teachers such as yourself. It's like a community effort rather. So organizations such as Poder en Sí. So my question is, how can organizations such as Poder en Sí help to create that brighter future and just make that future reality, or dream rather, a reality for Black and Latino students in NC, North Carolina, and really the nation as whole. So what can organizations such as Poder en Sí and other ones that are doing community work here, how can we aid in this effort for education?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so much that we can do. I think we say, okay, what are some focused areas that we want to put some attention to? And then we partner to do those. So some of the work, for example, that we're doing with CRREI is we're going to be doing some work together related to building a course companion guide. And so that we have some original material that goes along with the selective course that we're teaching. So we're partnering together to look at how can we take this, not just sort of have this elective course that students take, but instead of having to pull from a lot of different sources to teach the course, let's have a course companion guide that goes along with it. So I think part of it might be, as we think about sort of, how could we partner together, is I think getting the word out about how important it is that our students are educated. It shouldn't be, I mean, when you explained and you shared, that you were sort of whether in college or before you learn some of these topics, we don't want that to be the case for our students of color, right? It's our responsibility to ensure that before they graduate from high school, that there's some information that they learn about themselves, right? We think that, brown student lives matter, that Black student lives matter. We can show them they matter by showing them themselves in the curriculum. And so I think that not as a forced way, not as a required course, but as an elective course, right? If students want to learn, I think we create those opportunities for a multiracial group of students. So I think part of it is whether it's supporting our efforts to introduce this course. I think in high schools and middle schools, I think across our state and also outside of our state, I think it is one thing, certainly, whether it's having forums that you all host and we teach segments of the course to folks who are connected to your audience. I think that's a piece we could do as well too. So it might be that the folks, not everyone can sort of take that elective course, but we could teach segments and have some discussion, make that sort of connection between contemporary issues, historical issues. I think that's an important dialogue to have. And I think, forming those coalitions from university to high school to community organizations and middle schools, I think that would be a piece that we forge in terms of what I was so excited by the question when you asked the question about sort of, when you talked about sort of the whitewashing of history, I'm thinking, yes, we need to talk about that. So, but because that's such an integral part of the work that we're doing. So, but I think, depending on sort of how much interest you all have in sort of, focusing on that particular piece, with you wanting to look at sort of K-12 students or sort of, what pieces you're passionate about, or if there's work that you'd like to do in terms of, work with principals or with, I don't know if you're hosting any conferences or sort of what sort of thoughts you all had around sort of what aspects of sort of that education piece. And obviously you mentioned about civic engagement. So I'm just curious about sort of what specific parts might be most interesting for you all.
So as of right now, so last year we did host our very first People Power School. So that was a Zoom school rather over the course of a couple of months. So from the summer to it ended in December. I think it formally ended in December we invited fellows and interns and just young folks from our community to learn about these topics, but also learn how to get politically engaged and just different aspects of civic education. And so that was a program that we ran and we hope to continue in the coming years. But other than that, we're constantly connecting with young folks in the North Carolina community, because we know that the young people are our future. So just, pouring into them with these not only resources, but just knowledge building is what we did. So People Power School is one program that we're doing. And this Boded Speaks is another one of just, inviting people like yourself, Dr. McLaughlin, that can speak on just topics, relevant topics that are relevant to our community. So those are the other different ways. And I'm committed to this as a young person, as someone who, didn't have that experience going through K through 12, but want, the future kids to have that experience. So, my baby needs to have that. So yes, I'm committed to just staying connected with you and the work that you do, as well as your colleagues to make that happen.
Fantastic. Yeah, I look forward to that continued collaboration. That sounds great.
Great. So this is the formal ending of our interview, Dr. McLaughlin. Thank you so much for all your insightful comments and just perspectives. And thank you so much.
Great. Well, so glad we got a chance to meet and enjoy the conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Go to the oppressed. Go to the downtrodden. Go to the exploited. Go to the people who don't know who they are, who are lost from the knowledge of themselves, and who are strangers in a land that is not theirs. Go to those people. Go to the slaves.